So my name's Arthur Doler. I'll just get rid of the introduction part first. Or Art. You can call me Art. I don't care. Or Arturo, although I don't get that one often. I work for a company called Avature, which is also in Omaha, Nebraska. We're a consulting firm that we come in and help companies innovate and deliver software for them and help them figure out what they're trying to do and the best way to solve the problems they're doing. So it's a really fun, interesting job, and they also let me come and do things like this, which is exciting. I've been speaking for like 3 years now, and last year I did 13 conferences, which makes that was a little much. So let's see. Is there anything else to cover? Oh, there's my Twitter. There's my Gmail if you're interested. I generally don't take questions from the audience while you're all sitting here after this talk, because most of the questions people have tend to be a little personal. So I will be up here after the talk that you can catch me, and then after the talk, you can find me at the conference. I'll be here for the attendee party tonight, and then I'll here all day tomorrow. So, right, let's get this started. So, the talk is called Let's Talk About Mental Health. But what's it about? What are we actually going to talk about today? Well, we're going to talk about the human brain. You've got one, I've got one, not in like a jar or anything, that would be creepy, but between my ears, where everybody else's is generally situated. And when we talk about brains, we have this interesting language that we use sometimes. We say that the brain is sick or that it has an illness. But really, what's happening in this process, what's happening in that moment is that the brain is more fighting itself. Various portions of the brain are engaging and counter-engaging and activating, and the signals are getting mixed and between various past traumas and histories and everything else. And it becomes really confusing to talk about. Worse, there's a stigma against people who come out and talk about these things. We call them crazy. We call them a whole bunch of different stuff. Here in England, often mad is the word people use. It's compounded by the fact that we don't have a common language for this stuff. And so we co-opt this clinical language that we find used in the psychiatric profession, and we use that language as though it meant something to us. And we use it as though we understand what it means, which typically we don't. So today what we're going to do is talk about the reality of mental health. And we're going to talk about what is a mental health challenge, which is the language I tend to use instead of mental illness. And we'll talk about why I prefer that. We'll talk about some of the most common mental health challenges. And we'll talk about me for 20 minutes in the middle of the talk, because it's my talk and you can't stop me. No, we'll go over my story and you'll see why that's important. And then we're going to talk about how to talk about mental health at work. Please don't get up and leave. Please stay. I promise you that I will make the case that this is something you should be doing. And I'm going to tell you how to do it. And lastly, we're going to talk about some methods for good mental hygiene. Ways that you, diagnosis or not, can help keep yourself more healthy. So, you came to this talk, and I'm really grateful for that, because I'm up against John Skeet and Dylan Beatty and... Oh, there you are. Weren't you supposed to be talking? Fair enough. Well, then I'm only up against Dylan, which is fine. No, thank you all for coming. I know that there are a bunch of other interesting things, but you might be asking yourself, why should I care about this stuff? Maybe you're not crazy. Well, it's time for a reality check. If you've experienced any of the symptoms on this list for a prolonged period of time, or at least a couple days, a week, you may have been suffering from a mental health challenge. These are some of the symptoms, not from anyone's specific diagnosis, but from some of the most common diagnoses. And when you start looking at the numbers from things like the World Health Organization, 450 million people will be diagnosed and living with a mental health challenge this year. That is diagnosed. That is 6% of the global population. That does not, obviously, include people who come or don't seek treatment, who are dealing with this struggle alone, silently. That does not include substance use numbers. People who are using alcohol or other illicit substances. Over a lifetime, 1 in 4 people in the global population will have to deal with a mental health challenge. 25%. And when you think about The cost of that, not just in terms of the cost of treatment, but in terms of lost productivity, in terms of managing your disorder, your illness, in terms of the effort that it takes to do things. We globally lose $16 trillion, or will lose $16 trillion over the next 20 years in terms of lost productivity. And arguably more important, every 40 seconds, someone completes suicide. Like, that's what? How long have I been talking? 4 minutes? Fair number of people, even just since I've started. And these things have effects just beyond what's going on inside of your head. They affect your life. They affect your physical health. In the US, at least, I don't have global data for this, but having a diagnosis is associated with an increased risk of chronic diseases and a decreased use of medical care, especially preventative medical care. And you can see as much as a 25-year decrease in lifespan if you are diagnosed with what is called a severe persistent mental illness. And there's evidence that this is happening more in the tech industry than it is in the general populace. This is from the OSMI, Open Sourcing Mental Illness. They're an organization that does an annual survey of tech people, and they have a survey that says that almost 41% rather, of people said yes to, I have been diagnosed. And some 23 said maybe, which is way higher than the general population. And these things don't just have an economic cost or a personal cost, they have an actual time cost. The amount of effort you spend managing whatever your particular diagnosis is what, it gets bundled up into this thing called the DALY, which is disease-adjusted life year. Don't worry about memorizing it, it doesn't matter in any other context. But basically what that means is someone with a neuropsychiatric disorder will lose about 10 years off of their life, not in terms of not living, but in terms of the time it takes for them to manage their particular disorder or diagnosis. In a global sense, that's number 3. Below only cardiovascular and circulatory diseases and things like diarrhea, lower respiratory infections, etc. Standard kind of common diseases. These things are real. They affect more than you think they do. And they happen more frequently than you think they do. But we call them all kinds of things. This is some of the things we've called a mental health challenge just in the last couple years. Mental disorder, mental illness, psychiatric disorder, neuropsychiatric disorder, etc. And they have a lot of names, but I tend to prefer mental health challenge. I don't like thinking of it as an illness per se, because it's not something I'm going to get better from. And most of these are things you will not recover from in the strict medical sense. You could theoretically call them disorders. I tend to think of them as challenges. It helps me frame it as something that I am battling on a constant basis. But what is it? These things, these diagnoses, these mental health challenges, come out of this book, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Illness, Edition 5, the DSM-V. It's basically the big book of ways your brain breaks. Anybody here read it? No? It's a page turner, let me tell you. It's full of stuff like this. Checklists. Often fails to give close attention to detail or makes mistakes. Is forgetful in daily life. Is easily distracted by extraneous stimuli. Yeah, these are some of the diagnosis criteria for ADHD, which is one of my diagnoses. And it's a checklist. And what happens when you go in to get diagnosed by a psychiatrist or your GP or a psychologist is they will run down this checklist and they will see which of the criteria you meet. If you meet 7 out of 9, congratulations, you have this diagnosis. That's what these things are. That's how you get a diagnosis. There isn't a test for this. It's not something they can test in your blood or put you in an MRI and see. It's made more complicated by the fact that A lot of these things require a duration or an intensity measure, which is subjective for starters, and then has to be reinterpreted first from you and then through your provider, your medical provider who's diagnosing you. That's made even more complicated by the fact that some of the things we call disorders or illnesses are a part of the natural human experience. Being anxious, being depressed, that's part of being a normal human. When does that cross the line into something that is a disorder or a mental health challenge? Okay, that starts to get really hard to tell. And you can find fun stories of people being misdiagnosed with things and put on medication regimes or treatment regimes which made things worse. Yay. What I want you to come out of this with, and honestly, if you take nothing away from this talk, except one thing, take this. That a diagnosis is not prescriptive. It is descriptive. What I mean by that is that a diagnosis is not the same for everyone. Because these things are checklists, they're effectively just a giant bucket that we're saying all these symptoms are kind of grouped together in one thing. And we think that all these people have more or less the same thing because the psychiatric community needs some guidelines in order to be able to treat things. And it's not bad. Things will respond to certain types of treatments, similar things, but the expression of those diagnoses, of those challenges, the way in which they evolve and show up in people's daily lives is vastly different, can be vastly different between two people. And what that means is that if your great aunt Mildred has been diagnosed with something, you don't know what Bob, your coworker, is going through just because he has the same label on it. It's a different experience. They are descriptive. Psychiatry is attempting to describe what people are going through, not saying you must have all the things on this checklist in order to qualify. So with that, we're going to meet Jordan and Taylor, who are two people we'll be following through most of the rest of this talk. Jordan has been diagnosed with a mood disorder. Mood disorders are characterized by difficult or impossible to control mood. Almost everybody is familiar with the most common mood disorder, which is depression. And if you're curious, those are the numbers in the DSM-V that correspond to depression. Although the DSM-V, the 5th edition, offered this new fun thing where you can have like little writers, you can have like depression with a side of like panic attacks. It's like a really bad value meal.
So what do those numbers represent?
They're the DSM numbers. Like, so when you look up in the DSM, those will be the numbers you'd find it indexed under. The various different types of depression, major, minor, et cetera. It's like a very bad bird watching manual. Another common mood disorder is bipolar. And where depression, like people understand it, involves feeling low energy, feeling like you can't do anything, like you're not worth anything. Bipolar involves swinging between two poles, which the name implies. One of those depressive moments, but then the other are these manic moments. And in those manic moments, you're less in control of what you do, but you feel great. And if you have a particularly advanced diagnosis of bipolar, you can do things like kind of coming down off of a manic high and finding that you have sold all of your things, including your house, you've bought a yacht, and you're on your way to Italy, which is going to be a problem for you on Monday when you need to be back at your job, assuming you haven't also quit that. Taylor, on the other hand, has an anxiety disorder, or has been diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, rather. One of the most general anxiety disorders is generalized anxiety disorder, which is another one of my diagnoses. What makes me anxious? Everything. Yay, it's great. It's not great. Basically, I suffer from a low-grade anxiety constantly because different things make me anxious. Social things, getting up and doing this, going to work in the morning, finding my way from here back to the airport. But I'm glad that I don't have social anxiety, which is a specific and direct anxiety about social environments. There's also, in the category of anxiety disorder, something a lot of people don't realize is an anxiety disorder, which is obsessive compulsive disorder. And this is one that we see the media kind of not get right a lot. A lot of people, because it is the most outward and visible sign, tend to focus on the compulsions of obsessive compulsive disorder. But really, the thing that is key to understanding it are the obsessions. What happens is that a thought lodges in your head and you can't get it out. You can't stop thinking about it. It's running around there in circles constantly and consistently. And what you do in order to stop that from happening, in order to release yourself from this thought that you hate, because they're not usually pretty thoughts, is you do the compulsion. And that makes the thought go away for a little bit. And then you have to do it again because the thought comes right back. And the more you do this, the more complex and detailed your compulsions can become. When we start talking about tech, there's a different distribution of mental health challenges in tech than there is in the general population. Again, this is from the OSMI survey data. Mood disorders and anxiety disorders are number 1 and 2, which is what we would expect and what tracks with the general populace. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, is number 3, which is way higher than it is in the general populace, where it sits about number 5 or 6. Post-traumatic stress disorder is also higher. Nobody has a proven reason why this is true. I have a pet theory. Partially, I believe that it is a control thing. That we have, as I've joked before, an industry full of people who were bullied in middle school. And people who don't often have a lot of control in their own lives. And I feel that the control of a computer that will do exactly what you tell it, often to a fault, is valuable when you're in that emotionally vulnerable stage of adolescence. You find something that will always listen to you, always do what it tells you, or what you tell it, and that control gives you something you're missing in your life. Again, I have no evidence for this. It's completely my own narrative. But it's my pet theory. But remember, even though we're talking about these diagnoses, that these things are descriptive, not prescriptive. Even though I've given a number of the most common expressions of these diagnoses, this is not what everyone goes through when they have them. And you should not assume that. So, with that little bit out of the way, who is Art? Art was born into a family with a history of undiagnosed mental health illness. Attention deficit disorder, depression, potentially bipolar. His initial symptoms manifested as acting out, although these were masked by the non-standard learning environment in which Art found himself, namely a Montessori school. He developed a resistance to authority, which was masked by socially normative behavior whenever Art felt like he was being judged or evaluated, or in a public space. His impulsive actions led to significant struggles between him, his family, and his teachers. Initial attempts at diagnosis failed due to non-compliance and a significant lack of engagement in the process. As a result, family tensions continued to decline, or rather continued to incline. Art experienced a delayed entry into the American middle school system due to the curriculum discrepancies between the Montessori school in which he began and the United States middle school system, well, the Indiana middle school system. And so he entered midway through middle school in 7th grade. This delayed entry and his inability to control his impulsive behaviors led to a general isolation of his peers. Art's response to this was a reaction formation in favor of self-isolation and a prolonged depressive episode, which extended until Art was again placed into diagnosis. He was diagnosed with ADD and depression, and was placed on a medication regime, subject to frequent changes, frequent alterations, and monthly blood tests. As a result, his schoolwork improved commensurately. On the other hand, the patterns of behavior and communication already established in his family proved intractable and resistant to change, and Art's family situation continued to suffer. Art voluntarily relocated himself from his family's home in his senior year of high school to live at family members' homes as a removal from the situation. During this time, however, his social skills began to normalize. And he took the opportunity for college to reinvent his persona in the absence of familiar environs. Unfortunately, Art went medication non-compliant in college, leading to an expected decline in his academic ability. He developed a series of coping mechanisms, primarily involving the artificial imposition of stress and the addition of extremely negative self-talk. These coping mechanisms sufficed for him to graduate college and enter the workforce. And they maintained until Art took a job with a significant amount of systemic and internal stress, at which point the coping mechanisms began to fail. And Art began to experience panic attacks and to display typical aversive behavior. Art again sought therapy and engaged in a course of therapy for 1 year before re-engaging on a medication treatment. He investigated and adopted a mindfulness and meditation practice as part of his course of treatment. He has been 98% compliant, medication compliant, he's been 100% medication compliant for 6 years now, and 98% symptom-free. Or rather, his symptoms are 98% managed. Okay, I don't need the notes anymore. That was Art. But who am I? I always knew I was different from other kids. I could feel it, sense it in the way they talked at me, the way I felt myself behaving, the way I would do things. And I didn't understand why I would do things. I didn't understand why I would do things that would hurt people sometimes. I didn't understand why I did things that had negative effects for me. And when my teachers and my parents asked me, why did you do that? And I said, I don't know, they really didn't like that answer. And so I felt alienated. I felt like authority had failed me. And I, in fact, came to believe, and this is legitimate, that I was an alien, abandoned on this planet in some kind of Superman Clark Kent scenario where my parents had crashed in a spaceship and my loving human parents, my well-meaning human parents, had tried very hard, but they couldn't understand me because I was an alien. That's how alone I felt. And because I mistrusted authority, because I didn't believe that people had my best interests at heart, when my parents tried to put me in therapy, tried to get me diagnosed, I lied. I could hold it together for about a 45-minute session. That was fine. Now, don't get me wrong, I kind of blame the therapist, because if you let an 8-year-old buffalo you should probably not have a license. But I did, and he believed it, and he blamed my parents. There's nothing wrong with him, he's fine. You're just bad parents. That went about as well as you could expect. And so things got worse as a result of seeking help, not better. And when I turned around and I was put into middle school, I was put in that middle year. American middle school goes 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. It went right into the middle, right after everybody else had already formed these battle lines. And I was parachuting in like a World War I paratrooper into no man's land. And I did about as well as you would expect in that metaphor. Let me tell you this. If you are ever in a situation where you find yourself where people don't really understand you and you're not sure where you're sitting. Barking at people does not help. Just pro tip. But I did it because I didn't understand what I was doing. I didn't understand how to interact in that environment. I couldn't see the things that other people could see somehow. And it was the worst time of my life. I knew a lot of people say that in middle school, and it's entirely true. But it was definitely the worst time of my life. And when I eventually went back to my parents, I said, we need to do something. I need help. Can we do this again? And this time I bought in. This time I talked to the therapist about what was going on, what I felt. And I was diagnosed. And the diagnosis didn't mean as much to me as just the sheer recognition that it wasn't me. I wasn't a fuck up. My parents had been saying to me for years, Art, you're so smart. Why do you do such dumb things? Which is the most backhanded compliment I think I've ever still gotten. But they would say that and I didn't understand, I didn't know. And now I had a reason. I'm not just a fuck up. And that in and of itself also helped. The medicine that they started putting me on, I was on horse doses of Luvox and Dexedrine, which is what they used to give to combat pilots. Yay. Let's give that to a preteen adolescent boy and see what happens. The answer is, he finds the internet. And the internet changed everything for me. Suddenly there was a place where I could iterate, I could explore, I could become someone that I wasn't. I could practice with no risk of failure, or whether with no cost of failure. And I learned, it helped me learn to be a human, to talk to other people, to explore things, to express myself. I learned those things, how to be a friend that I didn't know, I didn't used to know. Unfortunately, at the same time this was happening, my family situation was continuing to deteriorate. I have a brother and a sister, and there was my mother and my father. 5 people in a house, all living with their own particular stripes of mental health challenge. And the patterns we had learned, the patterns of behavior during those periods of time when we were undiagnosed, just were so impossible to shift. I knew exactly how to get my father mad. It was like reading, like pushing buttons on a manual, just like, oh look, he's pissed off. Wait, why did I do that again? That was bad. And he would be mad, and one thing people don't always understand about ADHD is that it's a failure of the executor functions. It is a failure, an inability to control kind of what's going on in your head, the limited amount of control you have. And so very exaggerated emotions are often part of it, an inability to control your mood. And so all of those things combined just led my therapist to say, you need to get out of there. And I said, hell yes, let's do this. So I stayed first with my grandmother and then with my uncle for the rest of my senior year of high school until I went to college. I mean, they were in the same town as my parents. It wasn't like I'd been shipped off somewhere else, but it was a chance for me to be myself and learn to be without the rest of them around. And I took that chance in college, even further. I decided I needed to be able to be that person that I was learning to be on the internet. And I took those chances to become that person, to become who I really wanted to be. That's what college is supposed to be for. College is also for making mistakes. And I didn't drink a lot in college. I just went off my meds. Probably about as bad a mistake. I didn't need these. I was doing fine. I had lots of friends. Everything's great. Oh, wait, why am I not failing? I'm not passing these classes. How many times did I have to take fluid engineering? 3 times? Yeah. That's okay. Fluid engineering was an awful course anyway. But I had to learn how to cope without the drugs. And for me, what that meant was artificial deadlines, artificial stress, yelling at myself, telling myself that I was stupid, incompetent, I couldn't get these things done. Why haven't you just fucking done it? But it worked. I graduated. I'm not going to tell you what my GPA was, but I graduated. And I got a job, which is some kind of Christmas miracle. And once I had that, I was able to start learning more. I learned how to be a good developer. I took the things that I had learned about learning and built those up into being a better person. Until I took a job for a company that does election systems in the United States. It's probably obvious from looking at me, but I'm a huge nerd, and one of the things I am a huge nerd about is politics. So I cared a lot about this job and this process. And it was not the most well-run company. From a developer standpoint, let's just say that all of our clients had our BA's number, like literal cell phone number. So suddenly every bug was an immediate explosion. And I found myself sitting in a car outside work, wondering if I could go in, wondering if I could actually get up, like open the door, get out of the car, and go inside work. I found myself having panic attacks, although I didn't know that was what they were then. Points when I felt like I couldn't breathe, like I just needed to run, get out of there. And I know, because I am a smart individual, that that's not a good thing. And I went and I sought help. And I was diagnosed again, this time with generalized anxiety disorder and ADHD. And I was put back on medicine after a year of working with my therapist, talking, seeing if it was possible for me to not do it. And eventually we both decided that I needed to stabilize. And that first day I went on Adderall. It was like beautiful mind. Like the fog was clearing, and I'm just like, oh, I see. This is how things are supposed to work. Like all those things that I thought were so hard, all of those things that took forever. Like I used to have to play my anxiety off against my ADHD because I didn't used to want to make phone calls. So I'd have to like distract myself and have like the number in the phone, and then the ADHD is like, oh yeah, we have phone call, click, and then I'd be on the phone by the time my anxiety realized what was going on, and it's like, wait, what? God, now it's more awkward to hang up. Fine. Like I didn't have to do that. I could just pick up the phone and call somebody. I didn't have to use these weird coping mechanisms that I had developed, and it was amazing. It's like, is this how everybody else feels? Because if so, I want my money back. Like, I have a word about, like to take up some words with whoever was assigning stats. And I discovered mindfulness and meditation. I discovered ways to be more aware of what I'm doing, to monitor myself and build better coping mechanisms, better coping strategies that do not cause the amount of stress that my previous ones did. I found my own personal road to what's called recovery. It's not being cured. It's not being symptom-free. Living the best life I can. I found my road to that recovery, and I've been living it ever since. So, what was different about those two stories? They're both the story of the same person. And the difference isn't just the pronouns that I was using. I was using I in one case and art in another. The difference is that one of them was in clinical language and one of them was in experiential language. Clinical language is emotionless. It's focused on the diagnosis, on the medical definitions. And it offers a false sense of precision because of that seemingly medical diagnosis. And it's deficits-based. It's focused on what you can't do, on your inabilities. And it can often cause a sense of learned helplessness or passivity in your life, putting on this patient role. On the other hand, experiential language is by its own nature emotional. It is individual and tailored to that individual and their personal experience. It's tailored to their personal truth. It describes and it delineates what was going on. It does not constrain. And it encourages self-direction and self-responsibility. So, If we wanted to talk about mental health at work, how would we do it? Shock, we talk about it experientially. I may have jumped ahead a bit here, because now you're all going, wait, he said he was going to tell us why we should do this, and I am. When you were working in a team, when you were working in a group, it is impossible for you as a human, diagnosis, no diagnosis, whatever, to leave everything that's going on outside of work at the door. That is a fallacy that we tend to believe in, and it hurts us, actively hurts us, because then we feel guilty for not doing it. And then everything gets worse. Things happening outside work, affect our capability to work, affect our focus, affect us, and by extension, affect our coworkers, because we're not as on top of the ball as we could be. What I'm describing here, what I am pushing for, is for people to talk about their mental states using these experiential language. Because if you do that, it opens the door to having a discussion. Your coworkers want to have a story. There's a extraordinarily negative event in my life at the job that I was having panic attacks at, where there was a coworker who was consistently falling asleep at his desk. Like, seriously, head back, snoring. Like, that bad. And we made fun of him, because who does that? But did any of us actually ever ask him if anything was wrong? Why he was snoring? Why he felt like he just couldn't stay awake at work? Nope. We jumped to conclusions. We needed a story, and so we made one up. That he was spending way too much time playing whatever video game was out then. I don't even remember. It's before Diablo 3, so. We never asked him, and it's one of my great regrets. Which, my life's going pretty good if that's one of my great regrets. But there's another story that I got from somebody else in Omaha who was describing how one of his best salespeople, he was a sales manager at a bank, had suddenly stopped producing. And she was not delivering the sales. She seemed distracted. She seemed like she was not, like she'd given up on the job. And there are a lot of managers, a lot of people who would turn around and just wait that out. Turn around and turn it into a formal reprimand. Turn it into a moment where she's being written up or put on a performance improvement plan, and then she feels worse about the situation and everything spirals downward. But instead, he turned around and he sat down privately and asked her, "What's going on?" And her daughter had cancer. And he said, "Oh, okay, that makes a lot of sense, that you're not focused on your work and not doing as well. You've got a lot of other things on your mind." And what happened then is he gave her that space to lean out of work. And when he did that, he saved an employee that is now back to herself after having the daughter survived, after having gone through that experience of now she is well more committed to the team because he made the time and the space to listen to her. 2, she's back to selling like crazy. And he didn't have to find somebody else. He didn't have to train. He didn't have to waste time. When you talk about these things with your team, you open the door for each other to be vulnerable with each other. And when you do that, it gives each of you the chance to lean in and out of work when you need to. It makes your team more resilient. That is why I think you should do it. But we really need some guidelines around things. Because clinical versus experiential language is the difference between this conversation and this conversation. We need those guidelines because we're engineers and sometimes peopling is hard. I get it. Trust me, I get it. So I'm going to walk you through some scripts, some ways that you can do things at work, ways to talk about this stuff that will eventually, hopefully, become second nature to you. Because this is just not great. Nobody wants to be that guy. This is literally a conversation I've had at work. I consider it through like the strength of God that I did not shank that person. But when we start this, we have to sit down and realize that the first rule is that we're not going to solve or fix anything. Because if you tell somebody who is suffering from depression that they just need to smile more, they will throw you off of the nearest building that is more than 4 floors, and no jury on the planet will convict them. Because you will deserve it. You are not going to fix somebody. Trust me, they've heard it all before. You're not going to turn around and just be like, have you tried not having the ADHD? Oh, man, I didn't think about that. Sure, I'll flip that switch right in my brain here somewhere. So you have to come at this with the, like, you are going to help people. You're not going to fix them. This problem's not going to go away magically. Even if it is something that will go away, you're not going to do it. It's going to happen because that person is working through something or engaging something, unless you're causing the problem, which is a different talk. So, note, situations here hypothetical, advice is representative, every situation is different, please don't sue me, etc. Do not assume that I'm giving you the correct advice. That's basically what I'm going for. I'm giving you scripts to help you work through things, but it's going to take you knowing your coworkers, knowing who you're interacting with, to know if it's really the time or the place to be discussing those things. So, we're going to talk about Jordan and Taylor and some of their interactions. Conversational type 1A here is Jordan asking Taylor for future support. And all of this stuff will be in the handout. So we have an asking script. I could really use some support. Could you insert action here? It can be that simple. You don't have to drag everything into it. You can say things like, I don't know if you knew this. I deal with or I'm having problems with this specific kind of experience. In the past, you've helped me in this way. Would it be okay if I relied on you to do this thing for me in the future? As an example, Jordan could say, hey, I've been having a tough time with my mood lately. If you see me starting to isolate myself, can you just take me out for a cup of coffee, force me into some interaction? That will really help me. Ideally, Jordan is both clear and direct in what they're asking Taylor to do. Not vague, not, oh, hey, can you just do this, maybe this thing, maybe this other thing? And when they're asking Taylor to do those things. In this case, every Thursday or, every fortnight or whatever. Ideally, Taylor doesn't promise anything that they're uncomfortable doing. Because if somebody asks you for help, says, can you support me? And you say, sure. And then they need it and you don't because you didn't want to do it in the first place, that's really bad. Conversational type 1B. Jordan is in crisis and asks Taylor for support. Well, okay, hold up. We got to talk about crisis for a moment. Mental health crisis is a term for an event that is phenomenally vague because the experience itself is phenomenally vague. A crisis can be a panic attack. A crisis can be just being completely unable to focus and spun out. A crisis can be having a psychotic break. It's a very varied and diverse set of experiences. It's all of the fun things you get to have when you have a diagnosis. The basic gist here is that you are not going to understand that somebody is in crisis on your own unless you are familiar with them and their context and their life. But if somebody tells you, I'm in crisis, I'm having a problem right now, you believe them. You don't go back and like, oh, wait, does that correlate with last Thursday's crisis? If somebody says it, you believe them because it's important in that moment. We have to talk about safety in crisis because unfortunately, suicide is a thing. And I've heard it described as a voice inside your head trying to kill you. It's when you have such pain going on in your life that it seems sensible to just end it. When you can't envision, can't think, can't even imagine a world where this pain doesn't exist, where you are so trapped with your own personal struggles and demons, with no support, or even if you have support, where you just can't let it go and your brain constantly is whispering to you, you could just be done with it. That's all you have to do. And all it takes is one time that you have to screw that up, and your brain will kill you, which is really what suicide is. So, when somebody is talking about crisis, or when we're talking about crisis, you need to be cautious, but you don't want to be overly cautious. Very important. Don't be alarmist. If somebody tells you, hey, I'm having a hard time, don't dial 911 immediately. Or whatever the corresponding British equivalent is, I'm not even sure. 999? I don't remember. Okay. Yes. What you need to do in those moments is get the facts. Ask. What does that mean? Are you contemplating suicide? You're not going to put the thought in their head by asking. I guarantee you they've probably thought about it already. Like if it's bad enough that you're noticing or that they're asking for help, thought's in there somewhere. But you don't assume that they're safe, and you don't assume that they're not safe. You ask the question, you get the facts. If what you wind up with is a clear and unambiguous statement of intent to cause harm to self or others, that is when you call for help. And I will talk about a resource later that will help give you a very good way to navigate through these conversations. So, as an example, Jordan could be like, hey, you might not know this, I deal with some mood issues. I'm having a really hard problem telling what's real right now, what emotions are real right now. Because sometimes you can know what's going on and still be unable to stop it. Sometimes it can help when somebody else is there. Ideally, Jordan's going to ask for whatever they need right now as specifically as possible. As specifically as they can. And ideally, they're going to explain that if they need to leave the situation, they'll explain that they feel a need to leave. Ideally, Taylor's going to remain calm. It's really human nature when somebody comes at you and they're excited or anxious or nervous or whatever emotion they're feeling in that moment, we want to mirror that emotion back to them. We have these things called mirror neurons that activate, and we just feel that in the same moment. It's really easy to get wrapped up in that. You want to try and remain as calm as you can. Because your job in that moment is just to help that person in whatever they've asked for. And ideally, Taylor, if Jordan needs to leave, doesn't take Jordan leaving as an insult. It's not about Taylor, probably. I mean, if it was, Jordan probably wouldn't ask Taylor, hey, I need to leave, can you cover for me? Type 3, or 2A, excuse me. Jordan offering future support to Taylor. So in this case, you're offering support instead of asking. There is an offering script. Hey, I noticed that behavioral observation here. And again, you want to use that experiential language, not the clinical language. Don't come rolling in and be like, hey, I noticed that you might have depression. No, because now you're going to HR and everything will be very bad. Use that experiential language. I noticed that you've been really down lately. Is there anything I can do to help? Or do you think you could use this here? Hey, you need a cup of coffee? Can I help that? Can I help provide that? Jordan could say, hey, Taylor, I noticed that when someone disagrees with you in a meeting, you tend to get really quiet and shut down, even though you really cared about what you were talking about. In those moments, would it help if I backed you up? This is a behavioral observation, and then something you're offering to do to support. Ideally, Jordan accepts no as an answer. Maybe that's not what the person wants. Maybe they're not comfortable with you providing that support. That's okay. You asked, They said, no, your job is done. You are a good person. And ideally, you keep that judgment and opinion out of it. Your judgments and opinion out of it. Taylor, ideally, will only talk about their mental state if they want to. This is not a forcing function to force somebody to talk to you about how they feel. If they don't want to talk about it, that's okay too. And ideally, Taylor's going to provide some clear guidance for what Jordan can do. Type 2B, predictably, Taylor is in crisis and Jordan's offering support. This follows the same rules before about crisis. So Jordan could say, it looks like you're going through a rough moment. If you need me to cover for you, you can step out. These interactions, these conversations are really that simple. Ideally, Jordan's keeping their judgment and opinion out of it again. And ideally, they're going to follow the safety guidelines, unless they have prearranged a support response with Taylor. And we'll talk about a tool you can use to do that later. Ideally, Taylor's going to be honest about what they need, even if it's nothing. Even if you don't need anything. It's okay to say no. I don't need anything right now. Nothing's really going to help. And ideally, Taylor won't be assuming that they're a waste of Jordan's time. It's very, very easy when you're in those, especially in those moments of crisis, to listen to the voices in your head that say you're not worth it, you're not worth the time, you're not worth anybody's effort. Why would you let anybody spend any time or energy on you? Ignore the hell out of those voices. You're worth it. Somebody is offering support. Take it, if you want it. Type 3, it's kind of more explaining. Taylor explaining to Jordan what they feel. So we have an explanation script, Mad Lib style. When an event happens, I sometimes, often, or always feel like insert feeling here. To cope with that, I insert behavior here. You're explaining, when this thing happens, this is how I feel. In order to deal with that, I do this thing. So as an example, Taylor could say, when I'm in a meeting and somebody asks me a question, my brain freezes, and all I can think about is what happens if I screw up an answer incorrectly. So what I try to do is prepare and obsess over things in the meeting that people could ask me about. So I tend to not be very responsive before, like for an hour before a meeting. Ideally, Jordan's not going to problem solve and will listen respectfully. And ideally, Taylor is going to avoid blaming or ranting. Those are both pretty negative emotions that you can bring up in those moments. And ideally, Taylor's not going to apologize for their feelings. It's also worth noting that, especially in this example, this could not be okay for Jordan. It is okay when somebody comes at you and explains, this is how I feel, this is what I do in order to cope with it, to turn around and say, okay, that's okay, but you are a customer support rep, so it's very important that you be responsive. Is there any other way we can try and solve this thing? Is there any other way we can help you deal with the feelings? It opens a conversation. It doesn't automatically close and say, I win because I talked about my feelings. Type 4 is the check-in, Taylor checking in with Jordan. There's a check-in script. It's probably nice and easy. Woo. It's easy. The thing we ask each other every morning, hey, how you doing? Doing great. Living the dream. Woo. You can turn that into a more substantive conversation if both sides are willing to do it. You can turn that into, hey, I'm feeling a little tired today. Oh, that sucks. I get what you mean. I've, not just feeling tired, but last couple of days I've been really dragged out because my head's been stuck in this AWS space and is really making my brain ache. You can turn that into a way to check in with each other, as long as you're being honest about those feelings in that moment. Ideally, Jordan's going to answer with as much depth as they feel comfortable answering with. If they come back with doing great and they just walk off, okay, conversation's done. And ideally, Taylor's going to legitimately care about how Jordan is actually doing. And they're not going to use this as a way to force Taylor to talk about, or Jordan to talk about their mental state. You can also, as Taylor, consider setting up a check-in script or a check-in schedule. Hey, every Friday we're just going to go out for a cup of coffee and see how each other's doing. That kind of regularity and predetermined event can help when somebody starts going off the rails emotionally. Type 5 is Jordan and Taylor talking like normal humans. Here's an example. Hello, fellow humans. A good day to enjoy things like oxygen and carbon, is it not? It's funny, but the gist of what I'm going for here is just because somebody has revealed to you that they have a diagnosis or they have these particular feelings or they cope with something in a certain way, not every conversation from then on needs to be about those things. Just because I have been diagnosed with ADHD, if my coworkers come up and every conversation we have is about that, I'm going to get pretty mad about it. Or, even worse, anxious about it. You're a human being. You could talk with another human being about StarCraft or Blizz Wars or whatever the hell the kids are playing these days. I know, it's Fortnite, but you can explore those things outside of this context. It's not the whole of that individual, right? This experience that they have, or even this particular type or strain of experiences that they have, is not all of them. Because otherwise you're like that person that walks up and it's like, how is your blood sugar this morning? The person with diabetes. It's like, stab. Ideally, everybody treats each other like they're a human who's worthy of respect, worthy of being considered that they have these other interests. But what if you don't want to talk about it? I've exhorted you to talk about it, and I think that it is worth doing. If you do not agree with me, or if you have, say, a coworker like Steve. Is anybody here named Steve? Wow, I think that may be the first time nobody, so screw Steve. Even if you have a coworker like Steve and you don't want to talk with Steve about it because Steve's an asshole and everybody knows it, don't talk about it with Steve. You don't have to. You are in charge of who you talk about this with. You are in charge of your feelings and your communication. And if your workplace is not an environment where this would be helpful or conducive, first off, I am sorry. I feel for you. I empathize. I've worked in those places and it's really shitty. But you don't have to talk about it. Nobody can make you. Oh, there we go. I don't even need this slide. When you're doing all of this, the goal is to remain compassionate. As you work through these scripts, have empathy, have compassion for each other. Care about each other as human beings. That kind of connection, that kind of focus in a team or in a group will help build group cohesion. I've been working through like 2 giant textbooks on team dynamics and group dynamics for a talk on teamwork I'm giving. And it just keeps reinforcing all the lessons that I've learned through my talking with other human beings, is that being compassionate and being empathetic to other human beings is a way to open the door to them being empathetic back to you. Humans tend to respond in kind. So this is a little bit of a digression, but I feel like I have to include it. Let's take a deep breath. It's time for some hard truth. If you are diagnosed with a mental health issue, you are not going to go psycho. You are not less than human. You are not incapable of functioning. You are not worth less than normal people. You are not less intelligent. You are not dangerous. You are not broken. And you are still capable of having human relationships. You are still capable of making decisions about your own life. You are still capable of participating in every part of life. You are still capable of logical, rational thought. We do not hear that enough in any culture that I'm aware of. And so it's very important to me to put that in here. All right, how are we doing on time? Ooh. Let's blow through some compensation techniques. And by compensation techniques, we'll call them supercharging techniques. These are things that are often taught to people as ways to compensate for their particular mental health challenge. But a lot of these will work for anybody, regardless of diagnosis or not. I had to learn them to be effective, many of them. But anybody can. Mindfulness and meditation is a great one. I learned a lot about it from this guy, Brad Warner. This is one of his books, Sit Down and Shut Up, which is basically the gist of meditation. He's a fascinating human being. Like, if his life story is like he was in a punk band in Ohio, and then he moved to Japan to make kaiju films, and then he became an ordained Zen Roshi. Which, like, if you told somebody in Hollywood that life story, they'd be like, that's not realistic. You go back to the drawing board with that character. But he's, as you can guess, he has a very unique take on Zen. But Zen, or meditation, doesn't necessarily have to be Zen. Mindfulness meditation is very clinical these days, in fact. And meditation, unfortunately, is often misunderstood because we think about it as emptying your mind, but it's not. It's about thinking, what's going on right now? What am I feeling right now? Or more confusingly, what am I thinking right now? Asking yourself those questions and then finding out that you're thinking things you didn't know you were thinking and feeling things that you didn't know you were feeling. That's a distressing moment for me, like it was. The first time I realized, oh, I feel that, wait a minute, how long have I been feeling that way? Because your brain is going on doing more things than you think it is. And the more we learn about neurobiology and modern psychology, mindfulness really snaps right into it. It's a practice that exists in a lot of religions, Zen included, but some practice of meditation exists in a lot of different places. And we're finding out that it's there for a reason, because it works pretty well with how our brain works. Another supercharging technique, diet, sunlight, and exercise. Woo! Yeah, I don't blame you. Yeah, okay. Diet, sunlight, and exercise, whatever. Clearly, I get enough exercise, right? I do go to the gym every weekday when I'm not gallivanting about the globe. It's important to realize, though, that as we think about your body, it is a system. Your brain is in that system. It is a component of that system. And so, good physical health triple equals good mental health. This is why they let me give this talk at technical conferences. Another technique you can use is the Wellness Recovery Action Plan, WRAP. WRAP is a workbook, basically, that asks you things like, what do you like when you're feeling good, when you're feeling well? What do you like when you start feeling stressed? What do you like when you lose control? And it then says, well, okay, what do you want people to do for you in those moments when you lose control? It offers a way to give structure for people to help you in those moments. And for you to realize things that are going on in your head that maybe you didn't. Because a lot of the time, other people will notice changes in us before we do. You can go through the workbook, the WRAP Crisis Plan. It's available on mental health recovery. It's also in the resources in the back, I think. So, another supercharging technique, therapy and treatment. And you say, wait a minute, didn't I say these would work for anybody? It's not just diagnosis anymore. We threw Freud out a long time ago. Therapy is for anybody who's dealing with something bigger than themselves. And it's not just drugs anymore either. There's a whole workbox or toolbox of things and techniques that you can use. And will work for a lot of different people. So all right, let's get some takeaways from this because it's been a lot of information. Mental health challenges probably matter more to you than you suspect. And diagnoses don't matter as much as you think they do. Remember, prescriptive, not descriptive. Being able to discuss issues with coworkers and others is important to your team's resilience. And you can enable these discussions by using these bullet points. Using experiential language, being descriptive, not prescriptive, being compassionate, and recognizing that just because you know for one person, you don't know for everybody. There are a couple of resources. I mentioned OSMI. That's a good one. UAK Mental Health First Aid Training. Mental health first aid is literally first aid for mental health things. It's one of the resources that will help you learn to be able to deal with somebody who admits to you that they're contemplating suicide. If you want to know how to help somebody in those moments, this course will teach you. They offer 2-day, 1-day, and half-day courses. If you are not from the UK, there is a global mental health first aid training site and you can see if your country has a particular program. Mental Health America is a good site, even for if you're not in America. It offers a bunch of self-screening tools. It's not a diagnosis, but it might help you guide a conversation with a counselor or something. In the UK, there are three different UK crisis and suicide lines. Samaritans is kind of the big one. There's also Childline for people under 19, and Silverline for older people. If you, again, not from the UK, you can go to suicide.org. They have a list of international suicide hotlines and some information on how to help a suicidal person, et cetera. I will skip past this one because I'm running out of time. You can tweet me feedback. I would really love it. It's at Arthur Doler. If you can just tweet me one thing I did well and one thing I could do better in this talk. I will be up here packing up and available for questions, and you can catch me anywhere else at the conference, and again at the attendee party tonight. Thank you very much for letting me talk to you for an hour. I really appreciate you.